Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Airport Communities Podcast. My name is J.C. Harris, and I am your host for today. We're going to introduce another airport term today you can use to impress your friends. But the two lessons we want you to take away are, A, this is about public health, not any terminology, and B, don't try this at home. And to point B, let's get the obligatory scolding out of the way. When we began 10 years ago, our intent was to educate and empower others to create their own advocacies, and we were wrong. See, one of the advantages of doing this for a while, and you can tell that we're legit, is that we're happy to admit when we get things wrong and change based on new data. People come and go, and all this techno-burble is like trying to study for an accounting degree just to do your taxes once. And parenthetically, the people who run airlines and billion-dollar agencies like the port, they see people who don't know what they're talking about coming a mile away, and they are prepared. Your job should be to encourage the professionals, typically your city. Those people will persist, and they should bone up on these ideas and skill sets because they're going to be here and you're not. And these issues will take a long time to resolve themselves. We got to get out of this one and done thinking. Okay, that was the generic scold. Now we're going to get to the episode setup scold. The reason we avoid talking about ops and passengers and all that stuff is because it's addictive. People cannot help but try to, in that movie, the guy says, science the shit out of this. I mean, who doesn't love a graph and a chart, right? And it's like doing a puzzle. And we've been guilty of this many times. We're going to continue to be guilty of it. But what it tells us about today's issue is that you don't think of noise as public health. Not really. If you really believe in the public health aspects of noise, you want to think about dosage. Public health is about those kinds of words: dose, exposure, recovery, which no one ever talks about. And that's because we don't take noise seriously as public health. Think about the fireworks on the 4th of July. Boom! And then a half minute later, boom! And then boom! And, drives your dog nuts, with the thunder dunders, and they hide behind the curtain. But you know what to expect, and that's part of what makes it enjoyable. Why do you enjoy it? Is it the stirring in the heart concerning Francis Scott Key and the Battle of 1812? Of course not. Your body triggers this little physiological stress response. Same thing happens on roller coasters, and it's fun when you know what to expect. That's a dose. But if you're not expecting it, or even if you are at 2 a.m., in that flight to China, it's not just the sleep disruption. It's doing something to you, even at a sort of micro level, and it's not great. Okay, back to once a year. Let's say it happens a couple of more times this year, because the Seahawks, they get to that Super Bowl thing, right? That's a few more doses, but, it's fine. Okay, now, let's say that the fireworks start happening once a day. I don't know, maybe there's some big military victory. Who knows? The world's changing. But sooner or later, even daily, many people would just start rolling their eyes, because as a human being, you just become inured to it. But it would still be doing something to your body and to your dog. he might never get over it. But whether or not you thought it bothered you, it would still be a dose. And in that case, at least you'd have 24 hours before the next burst of events. Dose, exposure, recovery. If that sounds like injury, time to heal, that's exactly what it is. Now let's consider another stressful experience, at least for me. Going to the grocery store. Grocery stores have these daily rushes. There are just certain times a day that people will inevitably want to shop. Every store manager knows when they are, and so, you can plan for them. The store doesn't obtain any particular advantage from having all of those clusters of chaos. It's just something they have learned to accommodate. Airports don't work like that. Many airports, including Sea-Tac, to one extent or another, rely on banking. And I don't mean like, it means intentionally creating the equivalent of those rushes, clustering flights together into these groups. They aren't happening organically like at a grocery store. They are scheduled. You may think they would want to space things out nice and easy like at a grocery store. Not at all. They do it that way because they insist that it's more profitable to have those, the morning push and the evening handoff, and they have all these little nicknames, rather than to space them out equally. They do it intentionally, not based on organic demand. Now, if your house is within 4 to 8 nautical miles of the airport, you may have no choice with the current flight technology over the next decade in terms of flight paths, where the airplanes go, because it's essentially a straight line in, 400,000-pound tube, physics major. If airlines schedule as they do now with this heavy emphasis on banking, you're going to have the decreased interval between flights. Forget annual operations, it's that interval, 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 1 minute. Now, as little as 43 seconds during those peak bank periods that many people call the conga line. So that becomes the equivalent of a fireworks show 4 times a day. Not even 24 hours for your body to recover, not once a year, 4 times a day. That's the public health impact of an intentional scheduling strategy. That's banking. This, like a waiting, is just another way that we undervalue the physiological impacts. We talk in terms of passengers when we really should be talking more in terms of operations. Then we talk about annual ops when we really should be talking about those banked periods. What they really mean at the body level. Even talking about them per hour is misleading because it doesn't quantify them in a public health context. Imagine your kid is playing football. They're going to get whacked in the noggin several times every game. How long do they need to recover from each clonk on the noggin? How many of those should they be allowed to experience every game? What should be the interval between games in order to afford them time to properly recover? Dose, exposure, recovery. That is the heart of a regulatory standard. All of the junk nobody ever defines about DNL, SCL, and then LEQ, which is really the thing we're talking about today. That's public health. If you go to a construction site or a factory, they do noise measuring with those same not great A-weighted, but there will also be a limit on the amount of exposure for the guy running the jackhammer within a given period of time. It's like a certain number of credits. Stat people will beat me up for this, but you can only run the machine X number of times over your entire shift, and then you're done. There's a certain amount of math to it, which provokes smirks, but it actually tries to make something very thorny quantifiable. How many times can you be exposed to the jackhammer, not only just for, each event, but over the course of your shift? How do you space those events, single whacks with the jackhammer versus per hour or versus per shift, so that you balance the needs of worker health and, can still get the project built? Dose, exposure, recovery. Is the standard great? No. In fact, currently there are no regulations for anything beyond hearing loss, although the long-term effects of stress that I've described are very well known. They weren't first studied with aircraft, by the way. They were studied with factory and construction workers. The stress response has been known for a very long time. But in aircraft, there's no danger of hearing loss, and that's been used to further minimize the problem. There's certainly no hourly limit. Think about that. At least in construction and factory work, there are discussions of dose, exposure, recovery. The real discussion should be, what is the healthy limit of operations over any house within a certain time period and with a certain level of sound insulation? If you just roll your eyes and say 0, you'll never get anywhere. But that should be the conversation, because that's how public health works. You set standards. They may not be great standards, but you start there and then move ahead. Here are the number of lead particles we'll tolerate in our drinking water. Here are the number of noise events per hour that are legal over my house. And it's not just that the DNL standard is so pathetic, it's that you're not talking about it. The current discussion is simply based on the theoretical limit of separation between aircraft. People will argue, I think they can get 90 per hour, or maybe they can only get 83. They'll just argue over what is technically possible, not what is healthy. That tells us you may not be entirely serious about this. You have to further the research to the point where you are able to fill in those gaps and quantify the harm in the same way that we do with other regulated pollutants. What is even more frustrating to us is when people minimize the value of sound insulation. The value of sound insulation has little to do with whether or not you can have a barbecue on your patio. It is a tool to manage dose, exposure, and recovery. It not only reduces the overall load, it gives your body time to recover by smoothing those impacts. Even if it's not 24/7, just having a few more hours a day where it's not that intense reduces your exposure, meaning it makes you safer and healthier. This is one of the major gaps in noise research. We understand that there are overall impacts, but we don't yet know the specifics as to dosage, exposure, and recovery, injury, and healing time. Ironically, Sea-Tac, with its noise monitoring network and research teams, is perfectly positioned to do that kind of work. They understand LEQ, even if the rest of us don't. And it's just stunning to us. You have these fly quiet committees and roundtables all around the country, but the discussion of expanding the fly quiet period just to match the DNL 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. is like people have never even thought of that. And that tells us you're not taking this seriously as public health. People have not internalized the public health benefits of having even another hour of quiet, how that has a significant impact on the health of you, your children, seniors. Frankly, our sense has been that people say public health, but it's kind of hand-wavy. What they want is to have just enough numbers, to look impressive so they can get a check or change a flight path. Those are fine discussions to have, but again, that's not taking science seriously. And the people on the other side of the table know this and don't take you seriously when you try that. You have to make it clear that your interest is based on the physiological impacts of noise. For example, if you're not advocating for better and expanded sound insulation, if you don't even know about options in flight scheduling, even at night, you're telling decision makers that you're not for real. And that makes things actually worse for everybody. But every time you advocate for even one more hour of quiet, that you make it clear the importance of even those wins, you're telling your electeds, your decision makers, the airlines, this is no joke. You're not doing it as some hand-wavy deal just to get a check or push noise around, as the FAA would put it. We like to have a little payoff in each episode, and I think this one is pretty juicy. I'm sorry. I think we owe you an apology. We've been unusually scoldy with not one, but two setup scolds, and we've just been beating on you for being disinterested in sound insulation and noise research, and it's not your fault. This is the heart of the casino. Several weeks ago, we got some, sort of snippy things about our episode on A-weighting, questioning my story that the origin of A-weighting and all that stuff was based on intelligibility. Friends, if you don't believe me, just wind back a little earlier in this episode and take a look at OSHA regulations for noise in factories and construction. It's based on hearing loss. Remember I said that? Now, how would you define hearing loss? Intelligibility, which is around 400 to 8K, which just happens to be that range that made Princess phones sound so good. With aircraft noise, there was never any, serious concern over hearing loss. I mean, you're just not having enough events. We have these news clippings from nurses saying there's really nothing to worry about with all the aircraft noise because it won't harm your hearing. 1979. Think about kids' football. It's not like kids have been in less danger in previous generations. We're just becoming more aware. And it creates this virtuous circle. Let's say you have a better helmet, okay? Then people just start becoming a little bit more aware of head injuries, and then a little bit more mindful of how many hits you can take and time to recovery and so forth. And that's what builds the discussion on anything from seatbelts to you name it. But you have to start with that awareness, and then you get the better research, and then you get the better standards. The DNL 65 system is a joke because it's based on hearing. Okay? But that does not mean that it does not have an intellectually consistent set of equations. It's just that they're so rubbish in terms of protecting human health that people don't care. Rightly, they don't care. It's like this elaborate religion to, some God that nobody believes in. You're correct to be dismissive. However, as so often happens in public policy, just because the foundation on which it was built was kind of bullshit, that does not mean that it did not create some good things. Sound insulation is one of them. We need a lot more of it. We need it to be far better. Think about any technology you have in your home, from golf clubs to your computer. They've had 50 years to develop far more efficacious, far less expensive mitigations within the home, including better HVAC, which was not particularly great back in the day. This is something they know how to do in the same way that a $300 TV today is better than a $3,000 TV was even 15 years ago. But as with better standards for anything from kids' safety to you name it, it only happens with your advocacy. And we understand it's that big no data, no problem. The whole topic of the DNL has been treated so unseriously. Obviously, you're not going to be particularly serious about it, but you definitely should be, because every improvement in sound insulation moves the entire discussion. As we said, banking is a complicated topic, but the only thing you need to know about it for now is that it is something the airlines control. Think about that. You don't have much control over I-5 and 405. They're more like the grocery store. They're going to have their organic rushes. And it's interesting to us that that has not come up in any discussion we've seen. This is why we sometimes struggle with consultants, because remember, their training comes from the FAA. That's their value proposition. So they also tend to think in terms of where, flight paths, not necessarily when, which is important in the domain of public health. We all tend to get trapped within our own loops. Just like the DNL 65, they can expand the fly quiet period from midnight to 5 to fit 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. restrictions. It may be more challenging, but they can make a good faith effort to schedule more evenly, just as they have been able to and can implement various techniques in the air, which are slightly less fuel efficient but easier on residents. It ends up being just, a few more cents per ticket. It's a negotiation. But that negotiation does not happen until you start doing it, until you start asking for things instead of taking what they say at face value and making everything all or nothing. Having the more nuanced discussion is far more powerful. Otherwise, we continue to go round and round, leaving gaps in our understanding of what noise does to the human body. We've been doing this backwards. Instead of obsessing about where the flights go or give me a check, what you want to do is negotiate public health. Dose exposure recovery for every neighborhood, and the rest of it takes care of itself.